Calvin Fontenot was 34 years old, earned a steady $51,000 a year as an HVAC technician, and for the sixth year in a row, he was sitting on the floor. The floor was a hand-scraped antique heart pine, probably worth more than his entire 2014 Ford F-150. It was located inside his father-in-law Bertrand's $1.7 million Garden District estate, a sprawling white mansion on Prytania Street that always seemed to smell faintly of lemon oil and old money. It was Christmas Eve, and the room was filled with the low hum of conversation from Bertrand's esteemed guests. Doctors, lawyers, and investment bankers, all perched comfortably on plush, $15,000 Roche-Beaubois sofas and antique Louis XIV chairs. Calvin, however, was relegated to a spot near the towering 14-foot Christmas tree, his back against the cool plaster wall, a plate of hors d'oeuvres balanced precariously on his knees. His wife, Marie, had tried to protest, just as she had for the past 6 years. "Daddy, there are plenty of chairs. Why does Calvin have to sit on the floor?" she had whispered, her voice tight with a familiar, weary shame. Bertrand, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a wardrobe full of $3,000 Zegna suits, had simply smiled a thin, dismissive smile. He placed a heavy hand on Marie's shoulder, his eyes never once meeting Calvin's. "My dear, it's a full house. We just don't have the space, Calvin understands. He's a practical man, aren't you, my boy?" The question was not a question. It was a decree. It was a verbal pat on the head, the kind one gives to a dog that has learned to stay. Calvin had just nodded, a tight, forced smile on his own face. "No problem at all. What up, Bertrand? Happy to make room." He didn't call him Dad or Pops. The man had made it clear from the beginning that such familiarities were not welcome. Calvin was an accessory to his daughter, a temporary blue-collar fixture in their otherwise pristine white-collar world. The floor was his designated place in that world. It was a physical manifestation of his status. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood the message. And for 6 years, Calvin had swallowed the bitter taste of humiliation, telling himself it was for Marie. He loved her more than he hated his father-in-law's condescension. But he had no idea that the floor was the least of the indignities Bertrand had planned for him. The real betrayal was far colder, far more calculated, and it was already signed, sealed, and filed away in a place Calvin would never think to look. What do you do when your love for someone is used as a weapon against you? Do you endure the pain for the sake of peace? Or do you reach a point where the only peace available is the one you build from the wreckage? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The life Calvin and Marie built together was a world away from Prytania Street. They lived in a modest 800-square-foot shotgun house in the Tremé neighborhood, a place vibrant with the sounds of brass bands and the smell of Creole cooking. Calvin had bought the house before they were married, a fixer-upper that had cost him $95,000 and every penny of his savings. Over the years, it had become their shared project. On weekends, while Bertrand was playing golf at the Audubon Golf Club with a $4,500 set of clubs, Calvin was on his hands and knees, laying down a $3 per square foot laminate flooring he'd gotten on sale at Home Depot. He'd spent countless hours rewiring the ancient electrical, replacing the plumbing, and patching the plaster walls. His work truck, the F-150 with 150,000 miles on the odometer, was a constant presence in the narrow driveway, its bed filled with tools and scraps of lumber. Marie, a second-grade teacher at a local charter school, brought in a salary of $48,000. Together, their combined income was just under 6 figures, a comfortable living in New Orleans, but a pittance by Bertrand's standards. Marie's contribution to the house was aesthetic. She had a knack for finding treasures at thrift stores on the West Bank. A $40 mid-century modern coffee table she refinished herself. A set of mismatched dining chairs. She painted a cheerful shade of turquoise, costing only $60 for the set and 2 cans of paint. Their home was filled with love and laughter, a stark contrast to the sterile, museum-like quality of her childhood home. The walls were covered not in expensive art, but in framed photos of their life together, a trip to a state park, a crawfish boil in the backyard, their wedding day. In that photo, Calvin looked so happy, his deep brown skin glowing in the afternoon sun, a simple $200 suit looking like $1,000,000 next to Marie's radiant smile. Bertrand stood off to the side in the photo, a shadow in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his expression unreadable. After they were married, Calvin had insisted on adding Marie to the deed of the house. "It's our home, not my home," he'd said, signing the papers without a second thought. A few years later, Bertrand had approached them with a financial proposition. He was setting up a family trust to protect his assets and provide for Marie's future. He suggested they roll their house into the trust. "It's just smart estate planning, Calvin," Bertrand had explained over a dinner at Commander's Palace, a dinner for which he loudly paid the $700 bill. This way the property is protected from creditors, and it simplifies things down the line. "It's for Marie's benefit, really?" Calvin had been hesitant. "I don't know, Bertrand. The house is pretty much all we have in terms of assets. I feel better with it in our names." His own father, a mechanic who had worked his whole life with his hands, had always told him, "Never sign anything you don't understand and never give up control of the roof over your head." Marie, ever the peacemaker, he had squeezed his hand under the table. "Daddy knows about this stuff, Cal. He's just trying to help us." Bertrand had produced a sheaf of papers. "It's a simple quitclaim deed to transfer the title to the trust. We'll still have a document drawn up that gives you both lifetime rights to the property. You won't notice a thing. It's just paperwork." He had slid a pen across the table. Calvin had looked at Marie, at her hopeful, trusting face. He looked at Bertrand, at his confident, authoritative gaze. He felt the familiar pressure, the feeling of being the uneducated, unsophisticated one in the room. Against his better judgment, he had picked up the pen. But something in his gut, his father's words echoing in his ears, made him pause. "You know what, Bertrand? Let me take this to a lawyer friend of mine, just to look it over." Standard procedure. Bertrand's eyes had hardened for a fraction of a second. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a flash of icy annoyance. But he recovered quickly, waving a dismissive hand. Of course. Due diligence. I wouldn't expect anything less." He had gathered the papers. "I'll have my assistant send a copy over to your friend." The papers never came. Life went on. Calvin got busy with work, Marie with her students. The holidays came and went, each one with Calvin dutifully taking his seat on the floor. The trust was never mentioned again. Calvin assumed Bertrand had dropped the idea, perhaps offended that his generous offer hadn't been immediately accepted. He had no idea how wrong he was. He had underestimated the depth of his father-in-law's arrogance and the lengths to which he would go to maintain control. The seed of the greatest betrayal of his life had been planted, and Calvin was completely unaware he was watering it with his own sweat and compliance. The humiliation was a slow drip, a steady erosion of his dignity over 6 long years. It wasn't just one event. It was every family gathering, every Christmas, every Easter, every birthday, every christening. The pattern was always the same. The first time it happened was Thanksgiving, just 3 months after he and Marie were married. They arrived at the Garden District mansion, Calvin carrying a $30 pecan pie he'd proudly bought from a local bakery. The house was overflowing with people, the air thick with the scent of roasted turkey and Bertrand's expensive cologne. When it was time to eat, everyone moved to the grand dining room. Where a long mahogany table was set for 20, with glittering silverware and crystal glasses. There were exactly 20 chairs, but there were 21 people. "Oh dear," Bertrand's wife Eleanor had chirped, her hand fluttering to her throat in a gesture of faux distress. "It seems we've miscounted." Bertrand surveyed the scene, his gaze sweeping over the assembled family and friends before landing, with pinpoint accuracy, on Calvin. "Not a problem," he boomed, his voice full of false bonhomie. "Calvin, you're young and fit. You won't mind taking one for the team, will you? Just grab a plate and find a comfortable spot in the living room." It wasn't a request. The comfortable spot was the floor. Marie had turned crimson. "Daddy? That's ridiculous. I'll sit on the floor." "Don't be silly, darling," Bertrand had said, steering her toward a chair next to a wealthy cousin. "Your husband is a gentleman. He insists." Calvin hadn't insisted. He hadn't said a word. He just stood there holding his useless pie, the smile frozen on his face, as the entire family watched him retreat to the living room. He ate his Thanksgiving dinner sitting cross-legged on that antique heart pine, his plate on his lap, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from the next room a constant reminder of his exclusion. He could feel the pitying glances from relatives who passed by. He was the outsider, the charity case, the man who wasn't quite good enough to merit a $200 dining chair. The second year, it was Easter. This time it was a more casual affair, a buffet-style lunch in the manicured gardens behind the mansion. O'Kane's dozens of wrought iron chairs were scattered across the lawn. Surely, Calvin thought, there would be a seat for him today. But as people began to fill their plates, Bertrand orchestrated a subtle, masterful game of musical chairs. He'd pull someone aside for a conversation, gesturing for them to take a seat, then guide another to a different spot until, once again, Calvin was the last man standing. "Looks like we're short again," Bertrand announced with a hearty laugh, clapping Calvin on the back. "Good thing the grass is soft. You can sit with the kids." The kids were his nieces and nephews, all under the age of 10, who were having a picnic on a blanket. A 30-year-old man, an HVAC technician who ran his own jobs and managed his own finances, was being told to sit with the children. He looked at Marie, and her face was a mask of misery. "I'm sorry," she mouthed to him from across the lawn. He just gave her a small, sad shake of his head and went to join the toddlers, who at least didn't judge him for using his hands to eat a dinner roll. The humiliation was so profound. It was almost surreal. He felt like a character in a play, forced to act out a scene of his own debasement. By the fourth year, the cruelty had become a casual, accepted tradition. It was Bertrand's birthday party, a catered affair with a jazz trio playing softly in the corner. Calvin arrived wearing his best, and only, suit, a $450 Navy number from Men's Warehouse. He'd just landed a big commercial contract and was feeling good about himself, feeling like maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. He walked in feeling like a professional. Bertrand immediately shattered the illusion. "Calvin, glad you could make it," he said, not even looking up from his conversation with a city councilman. "You know the drill? Find your spot." He gestured vaguely toward the floor, near the fireplace. It wasn't even a suggestion anymore. It was an instruction. The drill. It was a thing they did now. It was Calvin's role in the family. That night, the humiliation took on a sharper edge. A new guest, a colleague of Bertrand's, saw Calvin on the floor and looked confused. "Is his back bothering him?" the man asked Bertrand, his voice loud enough for Calvin to hear. Bertrand let out a short, cruel laugh. "Oh no, that's just his spot. We call it the penalty box." The men around him chuckled. "Keeps him humble." The penalty box. The words hit Calvin like a physical blow. It wasn't about a lack of chairs. It was never about a lack of chairs. It was a deliberate, ongoing public display of contempt. It was a punishment. But for what crime? The crime of being a working man? The crime of loving his daughter? The crime of not being born into the world of trust funds and summer homes? He looked down at his hands, calloused and strong, the hands that fixed air conditioners in the brutal New Orleans heat, the hands that had lovingly rebuilt a home for Bertrand's daughter. And for the first time, a cold, hard knot of something other than shame began to form in his stomach. It was anger. A quiet, patient, slow-burning anger. He sat on the floor, surrounded by men in $5,000 watches and handmade Italian shoes, and he smiled. But his eyes were like chips of ice. He didn't know how or when, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that one day Bertrand would pay for this. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew the bill would eventually come due. The final straw was his own wife's 30th birthday party. Marie had wanted a small gathering at their home in Tremé, but Bertrand insisted on hosting it at the mansion. "A milestone birthday deserves a proper celebration, my dear," he'd declared. The proper celebration included a guest list curated by Bertrand, a string quartet, and a raw bar that must have cost $5,000 alone. And of course, the seating arrangement. This time, Calvin tried to preempt the inevitable. Before the guests arrived, he found a folding chair in a storage closet and set it up discreetly in a corner of the living room. It was a cheap, $15 metal chair, a stark contrast to the opulent furniture, but it was a chair. It was a stand. Bertrand saw it instantly. He walked over, a glass of champagne in his hand, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for Calvin. "What is this?" he hissed. "It's a chair, Bertrand," Calvin said, his own voice quiet but firm. "I can see that," Bertrand sneered. "It's also an insult. Are you deliberately trying to embarrass my daughter on her birthday? Tucking yourself away in a corner like a servant? You are part of this family. You will sit with this family." He paused, his eyes glittering with malice. "On the floor, where we have room for you. Now get rid of this thing before people start to arrive." He turned and walked away, leaving Calvin standing by the folding chair, his heart pounding with a fury so intense he felt dizzy. He looked across the room at Marie, who was blissfully unaware, laughing with a cousin. He looked at the opulent room, at the life his wife could have had, the life Bertrand constantly dangled in front of them. He thought about the penalty box. He thought about being told to sit with the children, and in that moment, something inside him broke. Not his spirit, his patience. He slowly folded the cheap metal chair, the squeak of its hinges sounding like a scream in the quiet room. He carried it back to the closet and closed the door. Then he went to the living room, sat down on the floor in his usual spot, and began to wait. The rage was no longer hot. It had cooled into something solid and heavy, like steel. The game was not over. But he was done playing by Bertrand's rules. The reckoning began on a Tuesday morning at 10:17 a.m., not in a grand mansion, but in a sterile beige cubicle at a downtown bank. For months, Calvin and Marie had been saving, pinching pennies, working toward a single goal, buying out the other half of a duplex next door to their shotgun house. It was a mirror image of their own property, another 800-square-foot fixer-upper, and the owner had agreed to sell it to them for $188,000. Calvin's dream was to renovate it and, eventually, start his own HVAC business, using the other side as his office. Fontenot and Son HVAC, he'd imagined, even though he didn't have a son. It was about legacy. To get the loan, they needed to refinance their current home to pull out the equity they had built. Calvin had done the math 100 times on a yellow legal pad. The house he'd bought for $95,000 was now appraised at over $280,000, thanks to the neighborhood's revitalization and the sweat equity he'd poured into it. They had more than enough to secure the loan. He walked into the bank that morning feeling proud, carrying a thick folder of financial documents. He was wearing his cleanest work shirt and a pair of jeans, but in his mind, he was wearing a suit of armor. This was the first step toward building something that was entirely his own. He sat across from a loan officer named David, a young, earnest man with a slightly wrinkled tie. For an hour, everything went smoothly. David tapped on his keyboard, nodding approvingly at Calvin's meticulous records. His $51,000 annual income, Marie's $48,000, their low debt, their solid credit scores. "Everything looks great, Mr. Fontenot," David said, smiling. "Your debt-to-income ratio is excellent. The appraisal on your primary residence came in strong. There's just one little piece of paperwork I need to clear up." He swiveled his monitor around. "When we pulled the title for your property on North Valere Street, it came back as being held in a trust, the Bertrand Family Irrevocable Trust." Calvin frowned. "The what? No, that's not right. The house is in my and my wife's name, Marie Fontenot." David tapped a few more keys. "I see her name here, but as a beneficiary of the trust, not as a title holder. The transfer was recorded about 4 years ago." He printed a document and slid it across the particle board desk. "This is a copy of the quitclaim deed that was filed with the Orleans Parish Clerk of Court." Calvin picked up the paper. The air in the cubicle suddenly felt thin and hard to breathe. The document was simple, just a single page. It detailed the transfer of the property at his address from the grantors, Calvin Fontenot and Marie Fontenot, to the grantee, the Bertrand Family Irrevocable Trust. And at the bottom, there were the signatures, Marie's familiar looping script. And underneath it, a signature that was supposed to be his. It was a close imitation, but it was wrong. The C was too round, the F too flamboyant. It was the signature of someone trying to copy his name, not the quick utilitarian scrawl he used every day on work orders and invoices. His eyes shot to the date next to the signature, August 14th, 4 years ago. His blood ran cold. He felt a wave of dizziness, and the fluorescent lights of the office seemed to hum with a malevolent energy. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. "Mr. Fontenot, are you all right?" David asked, his face etched with concern. Calvin didn't hear him. His mind was racing, flipping through a mental calendar. August 14th, 4 years ago. Where was he? What was he doing? The date stuck out, a jagged piece of memory, a big job, a commercial unit. Where? Baton Rouge? He was in Baton Rouge. He had been in Baton Rouge for 3 days, from August 13th to the 15th, overseeing the installation of a massive 10-ton rooftop unit for a new state government building. It was a huge job, a major feather in his cap at the time. He remembered it vividly because the superintendent on site was a stickler for rules. Only you had to sign in and out every single day. He remembered the long, hot days on that gravel roof, the drive back and forth from the cheap hotel off the interstate. He remembered calling Marie each night, complaining about the bad food and the lumpy mattress. He looked down at the forged signature on the paper. A signature that claimed he was in a New Orleans notary's office on a day he was 60 miles away, working 12 hours under the brutal Louisiana sun. "This isn't my signature," Calvin said, his voice a raw whisper. He looked up at David, his eyes wide with a terrifying, clarifying realization. The floor, the penalty box, the condescending smiles. It wasn't just about social humiliation. It was a smokescreen. While Bertrand was making him sit on the floor like a child, he was quietly He methodically stealing the roof from over his head. He was stealing his work, his sweat, his future. The loan officer, seeing the look on Calvin's face, immediately became professional and cautious. "Mr. Fontenot, if you're claiming this document is fraudulent, that's a very serious allegation. My advice would be to contact an attorney immediately." Calvin stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He folded the quitclaim deed with surgical precision and slid it into his folder. The anger from all those years, the quiet, patient anger he had nurtured, didn't explode. Instead, it coalesced into a single point of cold, diamond-hard clarity. Bertrand had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the man he forced to sit on the floor. He had assumed Calvin was too simple, too unsophisticated, too beaten down to ever fight back. He had no idea that in his arrogance, he had just handed Calvin the keys to his own destruction. The war wasn't over. It had just officially begun. The drive home from the bank was a blur. The vibrant streets of New Orleans, usually a source of comfort for Calvin, seemed muted and distant. He parked his F-150 in front of his house, the one he had bled for, the one that was no longer legally his, and sat for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The rage was a living thing inside him, a roaring furnace. His first instinct was to storm over to the Garden District, to kick down the ornate wrought iron gate and confront Bertrand, to scream the truth in his face. He wanted to see the look on the old man's face when the lie was exposed. But then, the image of Bertrand's smug, dismissive smile flashed in his mind. The way he'd laughed about the penalty box. A public confrontation was what Bertrand would expect. It would be messy, emotional. It would give Bertrand the opportunity to twist the narrative, to paint Calvin as unstable, angry, ungrateful. Bertrand thrived on that kind of drama. He was a master of it. A screaming match would accomplish nothing. It would be just another scene in Bertrand's long-running play, with Calvin once again cast as the fool. No, not this time. The cold, hard knot of anger in his stomach told him what to do. Not fire, but ice. Not a chaotic explosion, but a calculated demolition. He took a deep breath, the air conditioning in his truck blasting cold air onto his face. He would not give Bertrand the satisfaction of a reaction. He would play the part they had assigned him, the simple, compliant, blue-collar husband. He would continue to smile, to nod, to be the good soldier. And while he played dumb, he would gather his weapons. He walked into the house. Marie was in the kitchen, grading papers. She looked up and smiled, her face bright with anticipation. "So, how did it go? Are we going to be landlords?" This was the first test. He had to look into the eyes of the woman he loved, the woman whose father had just betrayed them in the most profound way, and lie. He forced a smile, the muscles in his face feeling stiff and unnatural. "It was good, mostly. There's just a bunch of extra paperwork they need because of the way we have the title structured. Some old trust thing your dad set up." He kept his voice casual, waving a hand dismissively as if it were a minor bureaucratic hurdle. "It's a headache, but David at the bank said it's solvable. Just going to take a bit more time." The relief on Marie's face was immediate, and it was like a knife in his gut. "Oh, thank goodness. You had me worried for a second. You know, Daddy, he loves his complicated legal stuff. He probably thought he was helping." "Yeah," Calvin said, his voice flat. "Helping." He needed to get out of there. "Listen, I gotta run. Forgot I need to pick up a condenser coil from the supply house before it closes." It was a lie. The supply house had closed an hour ago. He kissed her on the cheek. The familiar scent of her perfume, a painful reminder of the life he was fighting for. "I'll be back in a bit." Don't wait up on dinner for me." Instead of driving to the supply house, he drove to a quiet park overlooking Bayou St. John. He sat on a bench and pulled out his phone. His hands were trembling slightly, not with fear, but with adrenaline. He scrolled through his contacts, past friends and clients, until he found the name he was looking for: Marcus Dubois. Marcus was a friend from high school, a guy who had clawed his way through law school at Tulane, and now had his own small practice. He wasn't a big-shot Garden District lawyer. He was a fighter, just like Calvin. He dialed the number. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "Calvin, man, how are you? Don't tell me your AC is out again." "Hey, Marcus," Calvin said, his voice steady. "No, the AC is fine. Listen, I need your help. I need a lawyer." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The friendly tone was gone, replaced by professional concern. "What's wrong?" Calvin took a deep breath and looked out over the placid water of the bayou. "I think my father-in-law forged my signature and stole my house." The second act of playing dumb was even harder. It was a Sunday dinner at Bertrand and Eleanor's house, just 2 weeks after the discovery at the bank. Calvin had spent those 2 weeks in a fever of secret activity. He had met with Marcus 3 times. He had dug through old boxes in his attic, his heart pounding, until he found what he was looking for: a small, leather-bound daily planner from 4 years ago. Inside, on August 14th, in his own handwriting, were the words, "Baton Rouge job, day 2. He had also found the credit card statement from that month showing a charge for a room at the Holiday Inn Express on I-10 in Baton Rouge. The pieces were coming together. He walked into the mansion that Sunday, the familiar smell of lemon oil and condescension hitting him like a wall. Marie was carrying a bottle of wine, a $15 Cabernet they could barely afford that week because he'd had to pay Marcus a $5,000 retainer. "Calvin? Marie! So good to see you," Bertrand boomed, kissing his daughter and giving Calvin a hearty slap on the back that felt more like a shove. Come in. We're just having drinks." The usual crowd was there. The usual plush sofas were occupied. Calvin knew what was expected. Without a word, he headed to his usual spot on the floor by the fireplace. He made eye contact with Bertrand, who gave him a small, satisfied nod. "Good boy," the look said. "Knows his place." Calvin nodded back, a slow, deliberate movement. He made himself comfortable, leaning against the wall. A picture of placid acceptance. Inside his mind was a whirlwind of legal terms Marcus had taught him: fraud, forgery, quiet title action, punitive damages. During dinner, which Calvin ate from a plate on his lap, of course, Bertrand turned his attention to him. "So, Marie tells me you're trying to become a real estate mogul?" he said, a smirk playing on his lips. The table chuckled politely. "Having some trouble with the bank, I hear?" Here it was. The second test. Calvin kept his expression neutral. He chewed a piece of roasted asparagus, swallowed, and looked up at his father-in-law. "Just a bit of red tape," he said, his voice even. "Something about the way the title is held in that trust you set up. The bank guys are confused by it." He looked at Bertrand with an expression of pure, manufactured helplessness. "I was actually hoping you could help me with it, Bertrand. I have the paperwork in my truck. Maybe you could look it over after dinner. You understand this stuff so much better than I do." It was a masterful move, a piece of strategic genius suggested by Marcus. "Make him think you're a helpless idiot coming to him for help," Marcus had advised. "The ego of a man like that is his greatest weakness. He won't be able to resist." Marcus was right. Bertrand's chest visibly puffed out. The condescending smirk softened into a benevolent, patronizing smile. "Of course, my boy, of course. It's probably just some junior-level loan officer who doesn't understand the complexities of estate planning. Bring the papers in. I'll sort it out for you. It's the least I can do." Calvin smiled back, a genuine smile this time. It was the smile of a predator that has just watched its prey walk confidently into a trap. "Thanks, Bertrand," he said. "I knew I could count on you." He excused himself to go to his truck, and as he walked through the grand foyer, past the gilded mirrors and marble tables, he felt a profound shift. For 6 years, he had walked through this house feeling small, insignificant, and poor. Tonight, for the first time, he felt like the richest man in the room. And he knew with absolute certainty that Bertrand had no idea what was coming. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in strategic precision. Calvin's life split into 2 parallel tracks. On one track, he was the same old Calvin, fixing air conditioners, kissing his wife, and dutifully playing the part of the slightly dim but earnest son-in-law. On the other, now he was a man methodically building a legal case that was as solid and unyielding as a block of granite. His first stop after retaining Marcus Dubois was back at his own company. He'd been with Fontenot and Son Air Conditioning, no relation, a bitter irony, for 12 years. He pulled his supervisor, a gruff but fair man named Frank, into the office. "Frank, I need a weird favor," Calvin began. "I need you to pull my work logs and dispatch records from 4 years ago, specifically the week of August 13th. Frank raised an eyebrow. 4 years ago? What for?" "It's for a personal matter, a legal thing," Calvin said, keeping his voice low. Frank looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Say no more." He turned to his ancient beige computer, the kind that cost $2,000 in its day, but was now practically a museum piece. Okay, his fingers clacked on the keyboard. A few minutes later, a dot matrix printer whirred to life, spitting out a continuous sheet of paper. There it was, in black and white. Calvin Fontenot, August 13th to 15th, job site, Louisiana State Admin Building, Baton Rouge, L.A. Supervisor, J. Henderson. Status, complete. "I need a signed copy of this," Calvin said, "and I need the contact info for the Superintendent Henderson." Frank signed the printout and scrawled a phone number on a sticky note. "Henderson retired 2 years ago. Lives out near Lake Pontchartrain now. Good luck." The next Saturday, Calvin drove his F-150 out to a small, neat house in a quiet subdivision. An older man with a weathered face and a saint's cap was out front, meticulously weeding a flower bed. "Mr. Henderson?" Calvin asked. The man looked up. "No, who's asking?" "My name is Calvin Fontenot. I was the HVAC lead on the state admin job 4 years ago." Henderson's face broke into a smile. "Fontenot, I remember you. You guys did good work. That unit hasn't had a single problem since the day you put it in. What can I do for you?" Calvin explained the situation, leaving out the family drama and focusing on the legal necessity. "I just need to prove I was on your job site on a specific day. Do you remember those sign-in sheets you made us use every morning?" Henderson laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "Do I ever? The state auditors were all over me on that job. I kept every single piece of paper, got boxes of it in the garage. Come on in. The wife just made coffee." An hour later, Mo Calvin walked out with a notarized affidavit from Henderson and a certified copy of the sign-in sheet for August 14th. His signature was right there at the top. Calvin Fontenot, 6:47 a.m. The evidence was piling up. He had the work order, the supervisor's testimony, the sign-in sheet, and the hotel bill from his credit card statement. Each document was a nail in Bertrand's coffin. The final meeting with Marcus took place in his small, cluttered office on Poydras Street. The conference table was covered in documents, a timeline of Bertrand's deceit. "This is airtight, Cal," Marcus said, leaning back in his $400 office chair, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "The forgery itself is a felony. The fact that he did it to transfer an asset into a trust he controls for his own benefit, that's fraud, plain and simple. And because he's a licensed financial advisor, he's held to an even higher standard. This isn't just illegal, it's a massive ethical breach. Marcus had done his own digging. Bertrand wasn't just wealthy. He was a certified financial planner who managed portfolios for some of the richest people in New Orleans. His entire career was built on a foundation of trust and fiduciary duty, a foundation Calvin was about to shatter. "So, what's the plan?" Calvin asked, his voice low. "We have two options," Marcus explained, ticking them off on his fingers. "Option A, we file the suit. It goes through the courts, takes a year or two. You'll win. But it will be a long, drawn-out war. Bertrand will throw money at it, hire a team of shark-like lawyers from a $1,200 an hour firm, and try to bury us in motions and delays. It will get ugly and personal." He paused, leaning forward. "Then there's option B, the strike." "The strike?" "We don't file the lawsuit right away," Marcus said, a glint in his eye. "Instead, we use the threat of it as leverage. We serve him with a demand letter, but we do it in a way that maximizes our advantage and his pain. We hit him where he is most vulnerable, his pride and his public reputation." Marcus laid out the plan. It was audacious, theatrical, and utterly ruthless. It was perfect. "The demand letter will state our case in no uncertain terms," Marcus continued. "It will outline the evidence, the forgery, the proof you were in Baton Rouge, everything. It will demand the immediate reversal of the quitclaim deed, the dissolution of the property's inclusion in the trust, and a payment of $50,000 for emotional distress and legal fees. If he refuses, the letter will state that we will not only file the civil suit for fraud, but also file a formal complaint with the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards and forward all evidence of the felony forgery to the district attorney's office." Calvin was silent for a moment. This was more than just getting his house back. This was about total destruction. "The disciplinary board," Calvin said softly. "What would that do to him?" "At best, a public censure and a massive fine," Marcus said. "At worst, they revoke his license, permanently. His career, his reputation, everything he has built his entire identity on, would be gone. Overnight." The beauty of the plan was its efficiency. It bypassed the slow grind of the legal system and went straight for the jugular. "So, when do we do this?" Calvin asked. Marcus grinned. "That's the best part. When is the one time of year that family, reputation, and public performance are most important to a man like Bertrand?" Calvin thought of the grand dining table, the assembled crowd, the toasts, the performance of familial bliss. He thought of his spot on the floor. "Thanksgiving?" Calvin said, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. "Exactly," Marcus said. "He'll be at the head of the table, surrounded by his family and his powerful friends, feeling like the king of the world. And right in the middle of his big Thanksgiving toast, a professional process server, a 6'5" ex-Marine I happen to have on retainer, Wiez is going to walk into his dining room and hand him a package that contains the complete and total implosion of his life." Calvin looked down at his own hands, the hands that Bertrand had so often dismissed. They were steady. The plan was set. The pieces were in place. All he had to do was wait for the holiday. For the first time in 6 years, he was actually looking forward to Thanksgiving. And for the first time, he knew with absolute certainty that he would not be there. Thanksgiving Day arrived cloaked in a crisp, autumnal sunlight that made the Garden District's grand homes look like something out of a magazine. At the Fontenot residence in Treme, the mood was tense. Marie was dressed in a new $120 dress she'd bought for the occasion, a swirl of fall colors. She was buzzing with nervous energy, checking her makeup in the hall mirror. "Cal, are you ready? We're going to be late," she called out. "You know how Daddy gets." Calvin emerged from the bedroom. He was wearing his usual work jeans and a faded t-shirt. He was holding a small, packed duffel bag. "I'm not going," he said simply. Marie stared at him, her perfectly applied lipstick a slash of confusion on her face. "What are you talking about? You're not going? It's Thanksgiving." "I know what day it is," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And I'm not going. I'm not sitting on that floor again, Marie. Not this year. Not ever again." Tears welled in her eyes. "Calvin, please, don't do this today. We'll talk about it later. I'll make him get you a chair. I swear, I will not let you sit on the floor." He walked over to her and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "It was never about the chair, baby. You know that, right?" She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I'm going to go stay with my cousin in Slidell for a few days," he said, holding up the duffel bag. "I just need some space. You should go. It's your family. Enjoy your day." He kissed her on the forehead, a long, lingering kiss. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," she sobbed, clinging to him. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," he said. "None of this is your fault." He pulled away, walked out the front door, got into his truck, and drove away without looking back. He had an appointment to keep. Not at Bertrand's house, but with his own peace of mind. The strike was scheduled for 2 p.m. sharp, and he needed to be far away when the bomb went off. At precisely 1:57 p.m., in the grand dining room on Prytania Street, Bertrand stood at the head of his 20-foot mahogany table. The room was filled. His wife, Eleanor, was to his right. Marie, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy, was to his left. The rest of the seats were filled with family, friends, and business associates, the pillars of Bertrand's universe. The air was warm with the smell of turkey and cornbread dressing, and the crystal glasses were filled with a $200 a bottle Chardonnay. Bertrand tapped a silver fork against his glass, the clear, high-pitched ring silencing the room. He beamed, his face a mask of benevolent patriarchy. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "On this day of thanks, I find myself looking around this table at all that I have been blessed with. A beautiful wife, a wonderful daughter." He paused, his eyes landing on Marie. "Though her husband seems to have abandoned his duties today, we won't let that spoil our celebration." A few people chuckled uncomfortably. Marie shrank in her seat. "But more than that," Bertrand continued, raising his glass, "I am thankful for the foundation of it all: family, loyalty, and trust." It was at that exact moment, as the word trust hung in the air, that the doorbell rang. A long, insistent peal. Eleanor frowned. "Who could that be? Everyone is here." A maid scurried to the front door. A moment later, she reappeared at the entrance to the dining room, her eyes wide. Behind her stood an enormous man. He was at least 6'5", with a shaved head and a neck as thick as a small tree trunk. He was wearing a simple dark suit that seemed to strain against his massive shoulders. He held a large, crisp manila envelope in one hand. "Excuse me," the giant said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence. "I'm looking for Bertrand Devereaux." Bertrand, annoyed by the interruption, lowered his glass. "I am Bertrand Devereaux. Who are you? This is a private party." The man took 2 steps into the room, his presence sucking all the air out of the opulent space. He ignored the question. "I have a delivery for you, sir," he said, his expression utterly blank. He walked directly to the head of the table and placed the thick envelope on the polished wood right next to Bertrand's plate. The sound of it landing was like a gavel. "You've been served," the man said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. He turned, not waiting for a reply, and walked out of the room. The front door clicked shut behind him, leaving a stunned, cavernous silence in his wake. Every eye in the room was fixed on the envelope. It was a foreign object, a piece of the ugly outside world intruding on their perfect, curated celebration. "What on earth?" Eleanor whispered, her hand at her pearls. Bertrand stared at the package as if it were a venomous snake. His face, which had been flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, was slowly draining of color. With a trembling hand, he reached out and picked it up. His initials, BD, were written on the front in bold, black marker. He tore the flap open, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. The top page was a letter, Amin Jassin with the letterhead of Dubois Law, LLC, printed at the top. He began to read. The room was so quiet that the faint crinkle of the paper sounded like thunder. Calvin, sitting on the porch of his cousin's fishing camp in Slidell, a cheap beer sweating in his hand, couldn't see what was happening, but he could imagine it. He could imagine the words Bertrand was reading. Fraudulent conveyance, felony forgery under Louisiana Revised Statute 1472. Evidence including a notarized affidavit from job site supervisor J. Henderson, a copy of the hotel receipt from the Holiday Inn Express, Baton Rouge, a certified copy of the daily work log, signed by Mr. Fontenot at 6:47 a.m. on the date of the alleged signing in New Orleans. As Bertrand's eyes scanned the pages, his face went from pale to ashen. His hand began to shake violently. The papers rattled. He read the demands, the reversal of the deed, the $50,000 payment, the threat of the civil suit. And then he reached the final paragraph, the kill shot. Failure to comply within 10 business days will result in this entire file, including all evidence of felony forgery, being forwarded to the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office and the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards for immediate disciplinary action. A low, guttural sound escaped Bertrand's throat. It was a sound of pure animal panic. He dropped the papers. They scattered across the table, some landing in a dish of cranberry sauce. The top page, the copy of the forged quitclaim deed with Calvin's real signature next to the fake one, slid to a stop right in front of Marie. She picked it up. She looked at the two signatures. She looked at the date. And then she looked up at her father. In that moment, the 6 years of excuses, the 6 years of he's just trying to help, the 6 years of misplaced loyalty, all crumbled into dust. The look on her face was one of dawning horror and absolute betrayal. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what is this? What did you do?" Bertrand didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. His carefully constructed world, his kingdom of mahogany and crystal, had just been blown apart, and the man who had done it, the man he had dismissed as a simpleton, the man he had forced to sit on the floor, was nowhere in sight. The king had been checkmated, not by another king, but by a pawn he had never even bothered to watch. And he had been served at his own table, in front of his whole world. The fallout was not a single explosion, but a cascade of consequences, each one chipping away at the foundation of Bertrand Devereaux's life until there was nothing left but rubble. The collapse was swift, brutal, and meticulously documented. The first consequence was the immediate implosion of his family. The Thanksgiving dinner ended in chaos. Marie, her face a mask of white-hot fury and heartbreak, stood up from the table, the incriminating document clutched in her hand. "How could you?" she screamed at her father, her voice echoing in the suddenly cavernous dining room. "How could you do this to him? To us?" She didn't wait for an answer. She threw the paper at him, turned, and walked out, while leaving 20 stunned guests and a shattered family in her wake. She called Calvin, sobbing, apologizing, and drove straight to Slidell to be with her husband. It was the first time she had ever chosen him over her father, and the choice was absolute. The second consequence was financial and legal. On Monday morning, Bertrand's high-priced attorney, a man who billed at $1,200 an hour, called Marcus Dubois. There was no blustering, no threats. The tone was one of complete and utter surrender. "My client is prepared to meet all of your demands," the lawyer said, his voice flat. Within a week, the paperwork was signed. A new quitclaim deed was filed, transferring the title of the Treme house, valued at $288,000, solely into Calvin Fontenot's name. Not Calvin and Marie's. Calvin's alone. It was a detail Marcus had insisted upon, a firewall to protect the asset from any future Devereaux family entanglements. The next day, a wire transfer for $50,000 appeared in Marcus's trust account. The cost of Bertrand's hubris was a total immediate loss of $338,000 in assets and liquidity. But that was just the beginning. The third consequence was professional. Calvin had a choice. Marcus had presented him with the victory and asked, "Do we still forward the complaint to the CFP board?" It was a test. Was this about justice or revenge? Calvin thought about the 6 years on the floor. He thought about the man who called him boy and laughed about the penalty box. "Forward it," Calvin said, his voice quiet. "It's not about revenge. It's about accountability. A man like that shouldn't be in charge of other people's money." What if one of his clients was an old lady who didn't have a son-in-law to find the forgery? The complaint to the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards landed like a mortar shell. An official investigation was launched. The charge was not just poor judgment, it was conduct which did not meet the high standards of honesty, integrity, and professionalism required of a CFP professional, specifically citing the felony forgery. Bertrand was forced to disclose the investigation to his clients. The whispers started in the locker rooms at the Audubon Golf Club and the bars in the French Quarter. The man who built his reputation on trust was now radioactive. His wealthiest clients, the ones with 8-figure portfolios, quietly moved their money to other firms. Within 6 months, he lost over $100 million in managed assets, costing him an estimated $1 million a year in management fees. His firm, Devereaux Wealth Management, which once occupied a full floor of a glass tower on Poydras Street, was forced to downsize. Then, downsize again. The fourth consequence was social. The story, stripped of its legal details but retaining its juicy core of betrayal and comeuppance, spread like wildfire through New Orleans' elite circles. Bertrand, the master of public perception, was now a pariah. Invitations to Mardi Gras balls dried up. Old friends suddenly stopped returning his calls. He and Eleanor were seen less and less. The $1.7 million mansion on Prytania Street became less of a castle and more of a prison, its occupants isolated by the shame Bertrand had brought upon them. The cost of his public image, once priceless, was now zero. The final consequence was the most personal. During the fallout, Bertrand left a series of increasingly desperate voicemails on Calvin's phone. Calvin never answered, but he saved them. They were their own timeline of a man's complete collapse. The first message, left the day after Thanksgiving, was angry and blustering. "Calvin, you have made a grave mistake. You think you can threaten me? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Call me back immediately and we can sort this out like men." The second, a few days later, was pleading. "Calvin, son, please don't do this. Think of Marie. You're tearing this family apart. There's been a misunderstanding. We can fix this. Just call me." The third, after the complaint was filed, was broken. "You've ruined me," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. Everything. My business. Yeah, my friends. It's all gone. Was it worth it? Was this what you wanted? The final message came months later. It was just heavy breathing and the sound of a man sobbing. A raw, broken sound that held no power, no authority, only the pathetic whimper of a defeated bully. Calvin listened to it once, then deleted it. The bill had been paid in full. The account was closed. 2 years later. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of a newly renovated shotgun house in Tremé, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house smelled not of lemon oil and regret, but of fresh paint, sawdust, and the rich aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen. This was the house next door, the $188,000 property that had been the catalyst for everything. It was now the official headquarters of Fontenot and Son HVAC LLC. The LLC part had been Marie's idea. The and Son part had been Calvin's leap of faith. Calvin sat at a simple, sturdy desk he had built himself from reclaimed cypress wood. The desk was clean, organized. On one corner sat a framed photo of him and Marie taken on the steps of this very house, their faces beaming with a hard-won joy. On the other corner was a stack of invoices, all marked paid in full. He had used Bertrand's $50,000 settlement as seed money. He'd bought a brand new 2023 Ford Transit van for $45,000, had it professionally wrapped with his company logo, and used the remaining $5,000 for insurance and tools. He had refinanced his own home, now valued at over $350,000, on his own terms, with his own excellent credit. The loan officer who had originally discovered the fraud now sent him referrals. His business was thriving. And he had 2 employees, and he was looking to hire a third. He specialized in historic homes, a niche that required patience and skill, qualities he had in abundance. He was known for being honest, fair, and meticulous. His reputation was the opposite of Bertrand's, built not on a performance of wealth, but on the solid foundation of good work and a good name. He was making well over $150,000 a year now, and every dollar felt clean. Marie walked in carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She had quit her teaching job and now managed the books for the business. She had found a new calling, one that allowed her to build something with her husband every day. Her relationship with her mother was strained, but healing. She hadn't spoken to her father since that Thanksgiving. She handed Calvin a mug and kissed the top of his head. Her hair was in beautiful, intricate twists that caught the light. The city inspector signed off on the Maison Lafleur project, she said, her voice warm with pride. They said it was the cleanest HVAC install they'd seen in a decade. Calvin smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. That's good to hear. He took a sip of coffee and looked around the office he had built, in the neighborhood he loved, with the woman who had stood by him when it mattered most. He thought, for a fleeting moment, about Bertrand. He had heard through the grapevine that Bertrand and Eleanor had sold the mansion on Prytania Street for a significant loss and moved to a small condo in Florida, a place with no grand dining room, no room for an audience, a place with only enough chairs for 2 people. He felt nothing, not joy, not pity, not anger, just a quiet, peaceful emptiness where the resentment used to live. He had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in the square footage of your house or the brand of your suit. It wasn't about power or control over other people. True wealth was the freedom to be respected for who you are, not what you have. It was the solid feel of a tool in your hand, the satisfaction of a job well done, and the love of a partner who sees you, truly sees you, whether you're sitting in a chair or on the floor. He had forgiven Bertrand, not for Bertrand's sake, but for his own. He had to let go of the weight of that anger to have room to build his own life. The floor had been a prison for 6 years, a symbol of his humiliation. But in the end, it had also been his training ground. It had taught him patience. It had taught him to observe. It had taught him that when you're at the bottom, the only way to go is up. And from the floor, you can see the cracks in a king's foundation that no one else can. What does it truly mean to be wealthy? Is it the number in your bank account, or is it the strength of your character and the love you build? Share your story of overcoming disrespect in the comments. We believe in the power of community and rising above.